So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this forum. I hope that all of you, I think over 200 or 300 people will be joining us to listen to the debate from the esteemed panel. So the faceless voice at the moment is me. I'm Bill McCall. I'm the current president of the Chartered Banker Institute, amongst many other things. And my job today is to facilitate the conversation about how banks and bankers are responding to this coronavirus crisis. It will be a wide-ranging conversation over the course of the next 60 minutes. Much of it will be based on evidence of real practitioners, and I'll introduce our panel members shortly. And there will be sufficient time for questions and answers at the end, although I can promise you they will not be as exciting or challenging as the Q&A at the end of the daily government briefing, where it does seem that it's a bit of gotcha going on. James Kirkup, who has just disappeared out of the frame, is sorting out his audio. James, a very fetching shirt, which we're enjoying. Say good morning. So I'll introduce those who you can see right now. We've got two individuals online at the moment. Steve Pateman may join us shortly. I know he is struggling with particular issues in his sector right now. So Alex Fraser is the Chief Executive of LIBF. Alex, if you would raise your hand just so people can identify, there we are. In time-honoured fashion, waving tells the world that you're there. Now, Alex is well known to some of you. He's the Chief Executive of LIBF, London Institute of Business and Finance. He has been there for quite some time. He, in his earliest days, was involved in the city in banking and moved to the dark side, I suspect, Alex, we might call it, to work for government, particularly customs and excise. You spent a considerable period of time at CAS and then moved to LIBF, which is an accredited university with degree granting powers based in the city. And you've been there for quite some time too, and connected to the Chartered Banker Institute through the banking connection. So Alex, welcome to you. James Kirkup will be known to many of you, perhaps through his Twitter feed, perhaps through his peripatetic writings. He is the director of SMF, and we'll say, or James will say more about SMF soon, but you can read and will probably have read The Telegraph, The Spectator, and a vast array of other publications where James has had his written word published. And James, the biggest question you're toying with in your own mind at the moment is whether you reread the Dragonlance trilogy. I saw you tweeted that the other day. It took me back to the 1980s and the success of the White Hickman books and the whole genre that spun off from it. And maybe that's a supplementary question that we can deal with in due course, because I know it's not the greatest thing that you are struggling with at the moment, although it is about good overcoming chaos. And I suspect there may be some degree of commonality between that and the very topic that we intend to discuss over the course of the next half hour or so. Steve Pateman, who may join us, is the gamekeeper who has turned poacher. Steve is Senior Vice President at the Chartered Banker Institute, which is a charity that runs Chartered Banker Institute because we've all got day jobs with the exception of the executive team. Steve left senior roles in banking. He has more scars of problems in banking, cycles and downsides and everything else at his time at RBS and Santander. And he is a non-executive of an Irish bank at the moment and recently left Hodge Bank. He told me some months ago that he likes a challenge, and he has joined a hotel construction and leisure group within the last few weeks, I suspect, meaning that he is really in the heat of the sectors that are being impacted considerably by COVID-19. And if Steve joins us, we'll have him consider the world as it faces him as chairman of a group in that particular sector. So without further ado, I'm going to ask both of the gentlemen you can see on screen to give a sort of upsum of where they think the world is at today, and the particular pinch points they are thinking of. Prior to joining, Alex and I were having a brief conversation about the good that may come out of the bad. So Alex, if we kick off with you, you're close enough and within earshot of a hospital in North London, and you can tell by the frequency of ambulances, etc., what's going on there. You did say that the kinder side of society may emerge and be a benefit. So I leave it for you just to amplify that thought, and the floor is yours for a few moments.
Sure. Thank you very much, Bill, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. So yeah, I guess if you live like I do in sort of the outskirts of central London, you certainly felt this very early on in a very dramatic way, as most metropolitan areas have done throughout the world. But what came across to us very quickly was the great community spirit that this awful pandemic has unleashed. And the amount of generosity and charity that are emerging, and people are really stepping up, and people who perhaps you wouldn't have even spoken to from 1 year to the next. You know what it's like living in London. You don't really meet your neighbours. Now it's really transformed, and I think we're all thinking now, as we read and we hear about potentially the peak having arrived, and we're not yet through it, but we're all thinking about the legacy and how we can all adapt the way that we live our lives, so that the great good and the great common spiritedness that's emerged over the last few months will remain into the future. And it's highly likely, at least sitting here today, that many of us will be working from home, at least for the majority of time, probably for the foreseeable future, and that therefore that spirit, that local spirit which has emerged, I'm sure will continue through that period. We don't have a sense yet of what the next step will look like. I think we can look at different examples across the world, but it's absolutely clear that there are large groups in society who will continue to need our help for the forthcoming, for the foreseeable future. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us not to regard this as a one-off, but something that really does result in changes, long-term changes in behaviour.
Within LIBF, the degree granting powers and the degrees generally, you do a lot around social exclusion.
Yeah.
And for individual students who ordinarily may not be studying for some finance-related degree, and there's a very clear link between our Chartered Banker Institute 2025 Foundation, where we similarly are encouraging and coaching and trying to help fund individuals who wouldn't ordinarily find a career in banking. What sort of values and standards do you think that your university is able to raise with the students that you're seeing go through your degree program?
Yeah, so at the moment, obviously, like all universities, we have a completely remote model. So all the teaching and all the student engagement is done online. But we're not alchemists, but we do our very best during the 3-year degree program to make possibilities, to create possibilities that these young people wouldn't ordinarily have. And that means that we give them a lot of coaching in terms of their interpersonal skills. We find them internships and placements at different financial institutions. But I think the single most important thing that we do is that we give them confidence. So you look at the sort of hype in the press and you read about how, banks are working really hard on diversity and inclusion. And yes, they are up to a point, but is that message reaching out to young people? I'm not so sure. When we do events, particularly for BAME, prospective students, particularly females, there is still a sense that banking is not for them, that they are at a significant disadvantage from people with a traditional university background, dare I say it, white Anglo-Saxon males. So I think it's about building their confidence, about finding them role models within the industry, and about giving them the skills that they need to succeed in the banking world of tomorrow, which is, we all know is going to be dramatically different, and certainly now after this is going to be even more different and call for a very different mix of skills. So that's really what we do.
Yeah, and the number of students that you're seeing go through, what is the spread, and where are the destinations? Where do they end up?
Yeah, so I mean, the majority of our students come from within the M25, and the majority of those are first generation university students, and the majority again are from different ethnic groups. So it's a very diverse cohort. We've been very lucky in recent years. We've had some tremendously bright students who got into institutions like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. They're perhaps the outliers. We're very proud of our relationship, very long-standing relationship with Handelsbanken, and every year a small number of our graduates end up there. And we still find students attracted to working, at the larger bank. So it's a wide variety of institutions. There has been, let's say, I'm not sure whether it'll survive this, but there has been an interest in working some of the challenger banks, because they're seen as more agile, offering better career prospects and deeper insight into technology. I think that will probably have to happen across the whole banking sector from here on in.
Yes, I gave you a very big build-up, that you're someone who really enjoys a challenge, and your contracyclical timing to leave banking and move to the leisure sector, the construction sector, and those that are really in the, with the exception of the health sector, you're probably in one that is in the face of the coronavirus problem right now. Perhaps you can give us a sort of wash down of where the world is at for you in this new enlightened role as a recovering banker.
Yeah, I think the challenge that I think is in this process is one of the scenarios that you would have, and therefore the challenge for businesses and banks is to try and work out how you can plot a way out of a template you would be facing into. I mean, clearly in the rate, banks potential sensitivities with requests.
Sorry, Steve, I'm sorry to cut across. We are getting very few words from you. It seems that the bandwidth is struggling slightly. So maybe if you switch off your video and just use the audio, that might give us a clearer sound.
Okay, I'll do that. I switched that off, so that's gone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The point that I was making was that in normal circumstances, when you are considering how to finance a business and you're thinking about the right gearing levels, you will model a series of reasonable downside scenarios, and you would test businesses' ability to withstand those scenarios, and the level of resilience you have. And similarly, your bank would be likewise in a test proposition. The challenge that we have today as a business, and banks have in considering making advances to businesses such as ours, is that we are dealing with an unprecedented situation that none of us are we're closed. And we don't know when we will open, and we don't know what recovery looks like, and we can model numerous scenarios that may or may not happen, but it is entirely outside of our control. And that is a uniquely rare position for any business to be in, whether you be a pub or a hotel chain or a chain of shops. We don't know when we'll be able to reopen, and we don't know what the number of customers that we will have, and the type of business we will have, and the cost base that we need to think about operating in that new paradigm. So I think the challenges for businesses and banks in considering advancing loans to businesses is an area of uncertainty when all the usual anchor points that you would use in a risk analysis are just not relevant or available to you. And I think that the answer is for governments to intercede and put in place significant lines of credit, either through CCFF or the CBILS facility in the UK, with a level of government support that is quite high. The reality is that it is still a low-pay business that has no idea what it's going to look like. And cash flows do. It is a level of financial burden on a business that was not there 6 months. And that will require businesses to reconfigure their cost models, reconfigure their delivery models, and think fundamentally differently about gearing in their business going forward. And so that's my take on it, wearing the hat I used to wear as a banker and the hat that I currently wear today as a chief executive, asking banks to lend me money.
So, Steve, we'll come back to that. A number of people have been joining us, and James, we'll come to you in a second. But just to recap who's on your screen, we've got Alex Fraser, who's CEO of LIBF, James Kirkup, who's the director of SMF, but also a peripatetic writer for a vast array of publications, and an observer, a keen observer of society and business as a whole. Steve Pateman, who is a recovering banker, who is now gamekeeper turned poacher, or the other way round, Steve, if you prefer, who held senior banking positions and is now chief executive of what will be described as a leisure construction business. And then me, Bill McCall, I'm current president of Chartered Banker Institute, and I'm also chairman of a number of private equity-backed businesses. That's what I do. I'm a recovering merchant banker of about 20 years and dealing with private equity portfolio companies that are in difficulty and facing the same challenges that Steve spoke to just a moment ago. So that's the recap for those of you who were joining the conference just a few moments late. Now, I know that some of you are having issues with sound and vision. I'm afraid that we are using the Chrome system that doesn't sit terribly well on Macs and various other things. And we are going to do our very best for the next little while. However, I'm going to speak to the Institute Technical Group about perhaps rerunning this on a different platform like Zoom or Teams, which many of you will be more familiar with, because I know that a number of you are struggling with the technology of this sitting on top of whatever you normally use. So we'll come back to that shortly. So thank you for those comments. James, I wonder if you can make a noise and we might hear you.
Hello, is this working now?
It is. Well done.
Right.
Jolly well done.
Right.
Good.
Sorry
James,
about earlier on.
No. These things are sent to try us. We talked earlier about creating a video of all of the things that happen on video conferences. James, as director of SMF, you've written quite widely on a raft of socioeconomic issues and the impacts on society as a whole. and the role perhaps of the caring, sharing banker, maybe a cast back to earlier days of the local bank manager being a part of a local community, etc., and where the world has got to now. Also, for those of you joining, James on Twitter this morning was asking whether I should reread the Dragonlance trilogy, which is the Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman series of books. For those of you who haven't, you might try. It's about chaos and bringing order to chaos, James. Something you try and do in many of the things you write. So give us your take on the way things are. Is it a dumpster fire, or do you see it as something quite different?
Well, let me try and you take a few of these things in order, going from the social market and the role of business in a democracy through to Dungeons and Dragons, possibly without drawing breath. The social market, just to be clear, I run the Social Market Foundation. We are a think tank based at Westminster, cross-party organisation. So I work for a board of trustees that has politicians from all the main political parties on it. Our main purpose is to try, as the name suggests, the Social Market Foundation, to try and make the best of an open market economy. But we've always thought that an open market economy requires a profit-making private sector that keeps and renews its social license to operate. Because if profit-making private companies don't keep and maintain the consent of the public they work with and serve, eventually that will translate through into political action that makes it harder for those private entities to operate on a commercial basis. So that's what we've always been here for. And I think, and I would say this, wouldn't I think the current crisis just amplifies and magnifies the case for that approach. And to pick up on some of the things that Alex was saying earlier on, we're obviously all reflecting on the purpose and nature of society and everything we do in it. What are we all here for, I suppose? And there's a lot of talk about kindness and obligation and responsibility, which is what really that's the basis of the challenge facing banking, as it's facing all private sectors of the economy at the moment. What are companies here to do? What is their purpose? And obviously, at worst, there is a collision here between a narrow shareholder value view of what a business is here to do. Is the job of the executives of a company simply to maximize return for the owners, the investors, the shareholders, and not worry about anything else? Sort of, if you want to get into the theory of it, the Milton Friedman shareholder value view. Or do companies operate in a social context where they have obligations as well as that need to make a profit? And obviously, politics, the world. I tend to operate in a political world most of my time, or with also politics in the media. Politics in the media is not great on the whole at teasing out some of the strands of this stuff, because if you're running a company at the moment, you have essentially those twin pressures. You have to make sure that you are bringing in more money than you are handing out every month. Basic requirement of solvency, and yet, particularly, this is especially acute for the banking industry. Banks are companies after all. You have a significant social expectation that your operations should be about delivering something other than just a commercial gain to your owners. That banking should be about more than profit. The purpose of your business is social as well as economic, and that's really that is the fulcrum of this. I think it's being amplified by particularly the injection of public money into the private sectors of the economy overall. Taxpayers are effectively providing support for companies. I think what we're seeing is the slow emergence of a wider social expectation that companies need to do something above and beyond returning value to owners. Now, that has not been crystallized into a very clear ask of companies yet, and that's where I think we are heading to. I think there will be, if we ever get back to something like normal, or in the next version of the next iteration of normal, I think there will be a more structured, coherent political conversation with social stakeholders as a whole about what it is we expect of business, possibly especially banks, because obviously with the legacy of the financial crisis and the folk memory of the bailouts, we saved the banks. What did they do in return? Is the essence of public opinion on the subject. There will be a new understanding and expectation of what people in business should be doing and should be aiming for as they do business. So that's the that I think is the challenge to come. I have some ideas on what those expectations, what those new standards should be, but I'm only very much I'm a very small voice in what I think will be a bigger, wider conversation in due course. I haven't managed to find an elegant way of linking to the Dungeons and Dragons point, but all I would say is you'd be very surprised the number of people around Westminster who were teenage Dungeons and Dragons players. I'm not quite sure what the significance of this is, but I'm keen to explore it. Anyway,
well, maybe James, that should be a declarable interest in due course. It may give an indication of teenage angst and everything else. You make the point about what I would describe as utility and the responsibility of being granted some kind of regulated license in the economy, and it can't just be about shareholder returns. And is there evidence that we're seeing a shift in public view of that? For instance, the example I give in the US right now, where most of the airlines are privately owned, many of them are facing significant challenges. Many of them are looking for government bailouts. There's been the publicized Virgin Atlantic situation, where Delta is one of the bigger shareholders, and they've said, well, we can't participate in some kind of rights issue we've got our own problems. But then you look at the history of airlines in the US, and there have been 50-odd Chapter 11s in the last 20 years. They've been buying back shares like no one's business, and they've been paying big dividends. So is it a matter of timing then for that utilitarian part, that when the good times roll, it seems that the agents who run these organizations are very well compensated, but when the bad times roll, it becomes a socialized issue? Is that the sort of tone of where you're at?
Yeah, I think essentially the additional yes is the short answer, and I think the additional question that you have to factor in here is what, for want of a better term, political populism. Trump and, now fading from memory, Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage all had something in common. They told a story of modern capitalism as a one-way bet where owners, and particularly possibly a particular sector of owners, could only win, and the ordinary working man, the ordinary stiff who pays his taxes, could only lose. And what you've just described is a perfect example of that. So we've sort of forgotten a little bit about populism as a political force in the midst of all this, because of, in a sense, it may be restoring faith in government, certainly bringing government back into the fore of politics. But I think eventually you will see a melding of the narratives of coronavirus and the pre-existing populist critique of capitalism as a one-way bet to, well, certainly address some of those questions as that bluntly come down to, if the state is going to create the environment that companies need to operate in, and in extremis provide the safety net to save companies from failure, what expectation, what should the state, on behalf of taxpayers, ask in return for that social insurance? And I think, dividends and buybacks are very much a very interesting question. Obviously, there's a whole, the tricky thing is that if it's simple, and I'm sure some politicians will come along and say, well, it's very simple. We're going to cap dividends. We're going to, that's where the focus will be. But of course, where do dividends go? Dividends go to owners. Who are owners? Owners are ultimately pension funds. Who are who are pension funds?
Yes.
The same people who are unhappy about those dastardly banks and the huge dividends that they're paying out. So it's not going to be easy. But the job of all of us, I think, in the middle of this is to try and, first of all, just to try and illuminate the conversation, to try and explain wherever possible that, bluntly, there are no simple answers, that you can't just whack one bit of the system and hope that another will gain. And hopefully, I think to approach that coming conversation in sort of good faith and with open minds about how where we should end up on it.
So I'm then going to lead into an observation about the C-bill, which is the business lending that the Chancellor announced some weeks ago, where a lifeboat of 300 billion was talked about, and through then moving that to Treasury, moving it to the British Business Bank, and then moving it to the agents, and most of those are the high street banks that we're all aware of, and many of our viewers and listeners will be employees of. And we then have this situation several weeks later, where there have been 30 to 40,000 applications, about 17,000 approvals, and out of the 330 billion available, 2.8 billion has been lent under the scheme, which is 1% or thereby, and an average loan of £170,000. We've now got this bounce back loan that the FT refers to this morning, that sort of wrong-footed banks by changing the threshold from 25 to 50,000. It strikes me that the C-bill, whilst the headlines and the sell side of it, James, that you are well aware of through the Westminster world that you live in, the headlines of the 330 million then going through several sieves of Treasury, who probably were whispering, but don't lose it. Then on to the British Business Bank saying, well, we've got to have regulation around it. And then on to the high street banks and the agents who are supposed to be the distributors of the loans. And what strikes me as just a rehashing of what was the old enterprise finance guarantee, which was a scheme that was used for this 80-20% guarantee and was always designed to be almost a last moment, last resort loan, with all the paperwork that goes with it. Is it fair to say, and Alex, to you as an observer of the sector, is the C-bill scheme, because of all of those pieces, doomed to fail?
Shall I start? Or
Well, Alex, yes. Well, James, please, with the Westminster view, and then Alex, perhaps on the institute side.
Oh yeah, I mean, what I'd say briefly, I suppose, is I remember speaking to a friend in Downing Street about the day that scheme was just being finalised before publication, and certainly the people who dreamt it up thought that they were making a huge intervention. I mean, the phrase that came out of Downing Street the day was, "This is war communism." I mean, this is we're about to socialise a large part of the economy, and they were expecting that loan scheme to be very, very big. I think so that was their expectation. I think in terms of the outcome, it's very interesting to compare C-bills to the furlough scheme. Now, at the moment, I should say, I mean, my organisation, I've furloughed a couple of staff, so I have some experience of using this. The furlough scheme involves HMRC doing something. Sorry, HMRC and ultimately HM Treasury doing something which are utterly alien to them. They're just giving away money almost without check. You go to the website, you log on, you say, "I'd like some money, please," and then a week later, HMRC gives you the money. And after the fact, there will be a check and verification to see whether or not that was you were entitled to the money. Essentially, it's a huge exercise of trust. And yet, the other mechanism to put money into business, C-bills, because it is passing through multiple layers, sieves, as you say, it is much slower. And I wonder whether or not, when there is a bit of reflection and consideration, there will be a reassessment about the value of doing things, of implementing policy like that directly and versus via intermediaries. But where that ends up, I don't know. But so it is very striking that we are, in terms of political narrative, rerunning the post financial crisis banker bashing of the damn banks won't lend. I mean, obviously when Lloyd and I pretty possibly videos to name names, but Lloyd's banking group is having a very tough time. I think partly because there is an expectation. You mentioned the local, which is very important there. There is still a social political expectation that Lloyd's, because it is a bank that we recognise as being part of our local high street of our local life, in a very British bank, that Lloyd's should be behaving better. And the more local you are seen to be, I think the greater the expectation on you to support your community and your country. I mean, bluntly, I think people don't expect international banks to behave well. They do expect their local bank to behave in a more purposeful manner.
Alex, would you like to add anything to that perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had a number of conversations with people who are deeply involved in this process from a banking perspective. I think there are obviously too many players involved in the process, as has already been said, but there is, I think, an underlying issue here, which is that whilst the big banks have been busy providing digital customer service, putting all the effort into the front end of the customer experience over the last few years, there hasn't really been any thought given to the back end, the operation. And where we are now, and I think it was Barclays chief exec who spoke this morning and said, look, part of the problem in executing these loans is that our staff don't want to go to work in call centers. And therefore, we're having to reinvent our entire business process. You could argue that should have been done a long time ago, because for as long as I've been around, we've been talking about banks needing to sort out their legacy systems. But I think most of the holdup is driven by the fact that this is not digitized, and taking too.
So you make a fair point, Alex, and I guess your time at Schroders all those years ago when you were in operations, many of those legacy systems are still around. Steve, from the bit that I find difficult to reconcile is the Treasury was expecting a certain number of people to be furloughed, and I'm told that the numbers who registered, 3 million in 1 week. And the number of businesses that touches is about 200,000 businesses. 3 to 4 times the number the Treasury expected. You then look at the other side of the C-bill position, and the numbers are quite small in terms of those getting through those SIPs. Steve, now the poacher, do you think it's about systems, or is there something else? Because one of our viewers has asked that, do we believe that the government will pay out in all instances of the 80%, because under the old enterprise finance guarantee, there was an annual budget. And when that budget was exhausted, you had to wait for the following year. So again, that policy on the hoof is also full of unintended consequences, I suspect. So Steve, from where you're standing, what's your take? And could there be a slicker way? Should the C-bill simply move to be an HMRC distribution of helicopter money, as the furlough scheme seems to be?
It's a good question, and I think James has made some really interesting points about the complexity and the ethics and the integrity of what we're working through, and the relationships between equity, debt, government, and capitalism. And sadly, things that really should take some time for reflection, we don't have time for reflection. I think the furlough scheme was, to all intents and purposes, a quid pro quo for a hell of a lot of people becoming unemployed very quickly, which is what you saw in the United States. So to a degree, the amount of people who furloughed staff, those costs would have arrived back at the government pretty quickly in a different vein maybe there would have been the window of redundancy. But a lot of the workers who've been furloughed, I suspect, are on very small redundancy packages as opposed to very large ones, and therefore they would have found their way into universal credit or something like that pretty quickly. So I tend to sort of think as furlough as a quid pro quo for unemployment not immediately going up, but there will be a gradual glide path into higher unemployment, I think. When you come to CBILS and its various derivatives, and I am now sitting on the other side of the table asking for some money rather than deciding whether to hand it out or not. And therefore I'm trying to be balanced in my perspective about what it feels like from the other side of the table. I think that banks are in a tricky situation in as much as we can all reproduce our accounts on the 28th of February and say it was great, we had a really great year. But we all know in our heart of hearts that actually the next year is going to be a complete disaster compared to the last year. And actually we will have cash flow shortages. The value of our assets is open to interpretation. The value of banks is somewhat open to interpretation given where they trade relative to book value. So there's a lot of the traditional anchor points are not there. And therefore, what the banks are trying to do, and I think really struggling with, is trying to apply their traditional anchor points about being prudent and sensible and not wasting taxpayer money and all that sort of stuff, for which they would get massively criticised, I suspect, with the fact that the fundamental anchor points which they would look to are not there. People cannot say, well, in September, I think I'll open my hotel and it will be 50% full and the room rate will be X. And in November, I'll be running X conferences and so on and so forth. You don't know. So I think the challenges for banks in applying the criteria that they are being asked to apply means that actually it is tricky for them to say yes with the level of enthusiasm and veracity that was initially implied in the scheme. And the only way you're going to get the money to flow more quickly into the economy, if indeed you think that's the right thing, is effectively for a lot of those guidelines to be loosened somewhat from where they are today, so that effectively it doesn't become a sort of post box where you just collect money, which I think probably not the right way to go, but it probably is easier to access than the current application process would imply. So for example, a lot of companies in the UK that own assets will finance those assets on a secured basis. And they may very well do that for a series of individual companies. So where the wage limitation applies versus the turnover limitations are all complex issues that probably don't need to be quite as complex as they are modeled. So I would say that you could make the government support schemes easier to access by loosening some of the controls that are around it and maybe taking some of the pressure off the banks that if they get this wrong, they'll be to blame. I mean, I think the banks are in a no-win position. If they lend the money freely and they find that the guarantee gets on, they'll for being too free the government's money. And if they don't lend it by being too prudent, they'll get blamed for basically not lending it. So I do think we're in a very tricky place. And if you look at the range of stakeholder expectations, they are definitely caught in the crossfire. And I'm not saying that to defend them. I'm saying that as an observation.
So the key aspect there is, of course, we've already got the Q1 impairment numbers from some of the UK banks, including both HSBC and Standard Chartered, who have a Far Eastern and African view. And also we've had JP Morgan and Goldman's and others making provisions for Q1. And these are into billions of pounds already. For the year ahead, they're already getting to maybe tens of billions collectively, because it's certainly not. One of our viewers has said, how am I meant to lend under business as usual when it certainly isn't business as usual? That is a key point. And the other question was, are the UK banks rescheduling loan payments to give reprieve to both retail and corporate borrowers? Well, we've got some kind of mortgage holidays, we've got some relaxation of personal credit card requirements and also personal overdrafts. But I suppose the big question there is, at what point does government become banking and banking become government? We're in a curious point of time So from a Westminster perspective, James, when does the government become the banker and the banker become government? And there's a gap, I guess, between.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, I think obviously we've already crossed a lot of what would have been political red lines already. I mean, the furlough scheme particularly constitutes the nationalisation of payroll in many cases. I guess calling the dynamics of this are quite difficult. I mean, what I would say is, and something that hasn't probably been explicitly been recognised in some commentary. Remember that essentially small business and small privately owned business is still the backbone of the Conservative Party. At Westminster, people talk a lot about the red wall seats and how the Conservative Party is changing to take in a new electoral constituency in the north. But even so, if you look at particularly the membership of the Tory Party, they over-index significantly among the self-employed, people who have started and run their own businesses, and those are the people who are most unhappy about the fact that they are still having to go through a number of hoops and processes and checks and balances to get the credit that they think they need to keep their businesses running. So I think it is possible, when if you look at that as a fundamental driver of political change, I don't think it is impossible to see a Conservative government wedded to traditional separation of church and state, private and public as it is, crossing that line to say, actually, yes, we will. What we've done, what going through the banks has not worked. Let's start to explore routes for direct financing. I wouldn't, I would not be deeply surprised if we get to that point.
Well, probably showing my age, but last time we had a Macmillan gap. We ended up with ICFC and 3i and all of those equity takers, and we may end up there. I mean, the prognosis of some leading economists, and of course, let's remember, economists more than often get it wrong. We're looking at probably 3 to 3.5 million unemployed people in the UK, because a vast array of people on furlough may not return. And as Steve said earlier, it's almost been a stopway gap to redundancy in due course, unlike the US, which went straight to the end. So 3.5 million unemployed, maybe 4 million. I saw one employment expert at Stirling University saying 4. We've got about 3 million in the UK of working age who can or can't or choose not to work. So we will have around 7-8 million people of working age within our demographic who aren't contributing to the tax coffers of the government. The National Health Service is now clearly sacrosanct, and the 200 billion a year is, which government is ever going to reduce that? We've got 200 billion on DWP, and we've got about 100 billion on education. So you've got 500 billion, 600 billion a year for the elderly, the unemployed, and school-age children. Within, and in context, our defence budget is about 40 billion a year. So it gives you an idea of where the big spends are going to come. So we are going to have the biggest government in terms of big government that we've probably had ever in terms of sheer numbers. But also, I would suspect, James, the biggest Conservative with a small c, market-led government with big government. So, Alex, where you are right now, where does professionalism in banking and finance come to play? And I've got two topics, watching the clock, we've got two topics I want to get to after this. One is well-being, and the second, the well-being of people within banking and the well-being of the general population. And the second is insurance. The insurance sector has been markedly quiet in all of this, and we'll come to that. But my point is that with big unemployment numbers in big states, I suspect, Alex, for the rest of your business life, Steve's and mine, and a young whippersnapper like James, maybe not. But for us, this big government in the UK is going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's right. Although I'm pretty sure it's against what the Chancellor and others, the helm of the Tory party, really envisaged. You know, I'm sure that they saw their role as diminishing, you know, from the summer onwards. I do think that the strides that banks have made towards defining better purpose, partly but not entirely driven by regulators' interest in culture and purpose, does stand them in good stead. And I think this will that march towards more sustainable business models and a greater consideration of a much broader range of stakeholders. I think we could look across at Europe and see what is likely to emerge there, but I think government-controlled financial institutions are an inevitability in a number of European countries. I think that's unlikely here. I think there are too many people with, you know, somebody said to me the other day, the only bank that really understands this crisis is C. Hoare & Co, because they're about to celebrate their 650th anniversary this year. But if you're not in C. Hoare & Co, you will at least remember some of the very misguided and well-intentioned government interventions in this space.
Yeah, and interesting that the 200-year-olds NM Rothschild are advising the government. You know, obviously drawing on their experience of the Napoleonic Wars and everything else that besides. Steve, I wonder, just on the insurance point, have you, through your business, been able to claim any business interruption? I've heard of organisations being flatly turned down and other companies going to law where they feel that they've got cover for this government shutdown. Forget pandemic insurance, unless you're Wimbledon, where you've done quite well this year and you had a pandemic insurance policy. But Steve, what is your experience, if at all, with the insurance world?
So I think, you know, there's been a lot written about this of late, and if you follow the Irish press, and I'm a non-exec at Bank of Ireland, so I do so. The central bank in Ireland have been quite critical of the insurance business in Ireland around their refusal to cover any aspect whatsoever of the coronavirus shutdown, whether you be in farming or right the way through to running a pub in the middle of Dublin. And frankly, the response to the insurance industry in Ireland is pretty much mirrored over here. They argue that the wording in the policy is around a specific incident at your specific premises, which requires the local authority to shut you down. And of course, you know, for many businesses, there have not been a specific incident at a specific set of premises, and the local authorities haven't been doing the shutting down, it's been the government. So that gives them three opportunities to argue that your policy didn't cover this type of eventuality. As you quite rightly observe, a number of people are seeking legal opinions on that. And certainly in Ireland, the central bank has guided the insurers to the concept of, if there is doubt, you find in front of the customer. This is all well and good in the event that if the insurance industry was to pick up the tab for this, then that would be very good for businesses, you know, in a number of countries. It would shift the problem from one set of businesses to another set of businesses. And I can remember, even though I haven't been going for 650 years, that in 2001, when obviously we had the World Trade Center terrible situation, a lot of insurance companies failed and relocated their businesses to Bermuda as a consequence of that failure. And I think all that would happen if the insurance industry was required to pay out would be that the insurance industry would fail, and there would be a re-establishment of the insurance industry from zero, like as there was in 2001, and the losses would sit with the with the current shareholders. I think the point that is really important here is that we are dealing with a situation where the government has prescribed the closure of businesses for very good reasons, and therefore you're not dealing with anything that is remotely normal in terms of what anybody would have contemplated. And therefore, I think you are in the difficult territory of trying to work out what is the best way out of a very difficult situation that nobody really saw coming in terms of its depth and scale. And I think, therefore, it's not, I don't think there are black and white answers to this. I think it is a series of steps that the business and government and the banking industry have to take together to get the economy to a better place over a period of time. And I would liken it more to, the steps that the US government took post the Great Depression. That seems to me to be a pretty good parallel for where we are today.
Yeah, understood. So you're articulating where I was hoping to get to, which is if it becomes an insurance problem, they fail, rather than the companies, which inevitably there will be a raft of companies will fail in the back of this. The bankers may take some of the brunt of that for not lending the 330 billion that's available, but difficult. One of our viewers has said, and it's a very interesting comment, which says, do we think that the HMRC DWP could end up in banking partnerships in due course? Well, that's a whole new discussion for another forum, perhaps, and we might take them up on that. I'm conscious of the time, given that our hour has been quick, which tends to suggest that the conversation was free flowing. We'll let the viewers and listeners be the judge of it. What I might like to do is I will ask Anna and the team at the Institute to gauge whether there is an appetite for more of this, because I would like to continue the conversation with each of you and possibly add others to it over the course of the next couple of weeks at least. And we may reschedule and do something else, given that I'm quite surprised pleasantly at the level of interest there has been on this. We haven't even scratched the surface. So Alex, please just give us your closing thoughts, and a bit like the Mr. Humphreys on Radio 4, in a few words. I don't want to crash the pips at 1 p.m.
Yeah, so I'm very optimistic about the future. I think this country has got, this huge potential to unlock, almost, I wouldn't say unique, but on a global scale, to unlock the power of technology. And this is going to force our hand. I think we're going to go through a rough few months. But if we make the right decisions now about our new operating models, and it doesn't matter whether you're in education or banking or government, you've got to make those calls now to build a system.
Thank you. James, you've written quite extensively on the triple lock and the benefits to the older generation, almost to the expense of the younger generation, who have been disadvantaged since the great financial crisis by asset inflation, but a negative return on wages, for instance. So I wonder if, when you said earlier that you see this as a magnification of problems that existed, and in times of trouble, these problems get magnified and it may become a catalyst for change. Are you hopeful for that at all?
Cautiously. I'm cautiously hopeful that there is scope for a sensible rebalancing of allocation of resource between generations, between up and mainly down the income distribution, and the possibility of a careful correction of the balance of both fiscal advantage given to capital to wealth over labor, if you like. I think there will be scope for an outcome that sees people who work on low wages hopefully be given more support, and it may be that it is necessary for some of that support to be funded by people who have ceased to work and who own valuable assets. But that's it's a very broad theme to end on, I guess.
Thank you. Steve, given you're now at the coalface of running a business as opposed to financing a business, are you hopeful?
I've spent most of my career being an optimist rather than a pessimist, and therefore I tend to the view that now would not be a good time to change. But I do think this is a challenge of a scale that certainly I haven't seen in 40 years. I think it does dwarf the financial crisis because it has a complexity and an uncertainty that the financial crisis didn't have. And it will require businesses to think differently about their models, as Alex has said. It will require the concept of how government and capitalism work together to be, perhaps fundamentally re-examined. We haven't touched on some of the tricky areas about the role of equity. And as I said, I think we have done the best we can falling off a cliff. At some point, we have to kind of build a parachute so that we have a safe landing. We haven't built that parachute yet, but that's not to say that we can't build it. But at the moment, we've dealt with a crisis as well as we could do. We now need to try and think about what the post-crisis world looks like, and as I say, build the parachute for the safe landing.
So to conclude, in thanking our three contributors today, I did ask one of the boards I chair a week or two ago, when your house is on fire, do you call the fire brigade, a salvage expert, or an architect? And the answer is slightly obtuse because it's about timing. You probably need them all at certain points in time. At the moment, we're dealing with the fire, and the people in the front line of the healthcare services in this country really are the ones facing this head on, truly like a candle in the wind. And at some stage, the salvage point will come along, and then we will have to deal with the architecture and rebuilding of systems. And I do hope that the well-being of our people, we've, as an institute, have 30,000 members around the globe. Their well-being is really important to us, as is their professionalism. And we hope that they, and those of them who've tuned in their hundreds today, have got something from this forum. So Alex, Steve, James, thank you very much indeed for your time. I do hope that you will be able to give us more of your time to take this subject further over the course of the next little while. But in the meantime, to all of our viewers, listeners, and our contributors, stay well. The very best of health and wealth to you and your families. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.